Well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here and be able to speak to this conference. And thank the Faraday Institute for, I think, putting on was a very interesting program. And certainly the question we're looking at, I think, is very significant. And as you'll see, in this opening lecture, what I'm doing basically is a sketch map of some of the themes that we're looking at. And in many ways, the title is very teasing and very provocative. It's in effect raising this question as to whether there is something absolutely essential about science and religion, which means that intrinsically they can't talk to each other, or intrinsically they have to make a choice between them. And there'll be a lot of things I'll be saying this morning, but I just want to begin by making what is a very obvious point, which actually in many ways lies behind much of our reflection. And that is that in many ways this question is very modern. It goes back to a period in intellectual history where things were very tightly defined, and perhaps in a more postmodern era it's not so much that there is something about these things that forces us to make a choice one way or the other, but rather we can choose how we see these. I think that is a very important point. That very often discussions about science or religion in fact proceed as if the issue is out there and we have to passively respond to it. But actually, in many ways it's up to us to make up our minds about this, because nature is much more pliable than you might think. Let's begin by looking at a very good quote from Peter Medawar. Peter Medawar won the Nobel Prize in Medicine back in the 1960s. He was an immunologist. He was also someone who thought deeply about questions of life, and he himself was a kind of skeptic, a kind of rationalist, but he was very much aware that life was complicated. And he has this rather nice quote: "Only humans find their way by a light that illuminates more than the patch of ground they stand on." I think it's a rather nice quote. The thing that's nice about it is saying, look, it's about more than just where's the next food source, where's the next source of nutrition. It's about deeper, bigger questions. And actually there's something about being human that it means you want to ask these questions. I think that is very important, because in many ways this whole interaction of science and faith is about the quest for a big picture. And in many ways I think the issue we're debating today is whether science gives you most or the whole of this big picture, or whether it only gives you a partial picture, and therefore you have to fill in other aspects from other sources. And I'll be taking that latter view myself, but of course there'll be others who will take a different perspective. So we might begin to flesh out the point that Medawar was making by some questions we might ask. I mean, these are all very straightforward questions. How do we eliminate poverty? Well, that's very straightforward. How can we live together peacefully? Of course, that's equally straightforward. How does adrenaline get released into the bloodstream? That's what my doctoral work was on many years ago. What's the good life and how do we lead it? Is there a God? And as I put those questions on the screen, you can see immediately they're all interesting and important, but they are in quite different categories. And the question really is whether the methodologies that help you answer one question will help you answer others. And in many ways, when you look at some of the big questions here, you can see we're really mapping out what Karl Popper famously called ultimate questions. And what he meant by that is big questions, existential questions, questions about the meaning of life, of good life and so on, which actually are very, very difficult to answer and certainly can't be answered empirically. And I think that's one of the issues we're looking at here, the great debate. If you cannot answer big questions empirically, then do you simply give up and say there are no answers, or do you say, well, maybe we can find answers somewhere else using other means? And in many ways that question is hovering in the background in any discussion about the relation of science and religion. There's a Spanish philosopher who I rather like. I've discovered hardly anybody else does, but that's, either that means I'm way on my own, or else I've got sort of a taste which nobody else has. But look at this. This is very, very good, I think. Scientific truth, he writes, is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. I think he's right. I think he's saying something very, very good. Science is great. Well, I put a big tick against that. But it has limits. And the limits mean there are lots of interesting, important questions that lie beyond its scope, and we need answers to those as well. And Ortega basically just goes on to say that we can't get away from these ultimate questions. They're always there. And here's the key point: because we are human beings, we can't stop asking them. Now I'm going to make a statement which I hope all of you will think is right and and unremarkable. Scientists are human beings. And you see, well, once you see that, then you say, well, actually, the interesting thing now is that it's very likely that many scientists will know that there are deeper questions that bother them as human beings that their science can't answer. And so they want to ask questions. And in many ways, what interests me is that the whole science and religion dialogue is very often driven from the science side of things, by scientists who realize that there are some very important questions that are being thrown up by their professional disciplines, but are not being answered by them. So you can see there's a very interesting way they're beginning to map out the questions we're looking at. Let's go back to Peter Medler. This is from a book he wrote towards the end of his life, from a book called The Limits of Science. And he writes this: we need to acknowledge there are questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. Now, I think he's right. And of course, he gives examples, reading life and so on. And what I'm trying to say to you is that really, there are these big questions. And really, the issue we're looking at this morning is whether science and faith can kind of come together and give us a bigger and better answer to these questions, or whether they're giving competing answers that push us in different directions, or whether in fact they have nothing to say to each other at all. And so my job this morning is to kind of map out the territory and give you an idea of some of the questions, some of the answers, some of the possibilities, to help you frame the questions, but also figure out what answers you might give. Now, this lecture is going to be light on history. And it's not because I'm historically ignorant, it's just that there's someone much better than me coming after me. I'm a bit like John the Baptist in some sense. We'll talk about the more historical aspects of the question later, and I think you ought to listen to him on those rather than me. But I've got plenty to talk about. And the real point I want to begin by making is this. Look, the question of meaning is not an empirical question. I mean, you can say, look, if you're a psychologist, you say, well, look, we can empirically say that meaning matters to people. There are lots and lots of studies that show that people are more stable, tend to be better in terms of their quality of life and so on, if they've sorted out questions of life. But empirical methods don't answer those questions. They show they're important. So it really does put us in an interesting position. We can't read off meaning from nature. Meaning is really about an interpretation, not so much a cognitive interpretation as an existential interpretation. And thus there's a sense in which it's always going to lie beyond proof. It's always going to be, if I can put it very, very crudely, a matter of faith. And one thing I want to say to you is, look, you mustn't get worried by that. I mean, some people, I think, say, look, if you can't prove something, you're in real trouble. But I want to suggest to you, I'll come back to this in my afternoon lecture, actually there are relatively few areas in life where you've got cut and dried, absolutely certain answers. In most areas of life, it's going to be a question of judgment. Again, I began this lecture by talking about this distinction between modernity and postmodernity. And if you go back to Descartes and Spinoza, you're looking for clear-cut answers, which can be shown to be right. If you're kind of a more recent and thinking in terms of Heidegger or Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein rather, then you're going to say, look, we can best aim for fiduciary judgments. That's to say, we have good reasons for thinking this is right, but we can't actually conclusively show it's right. But we can live with that, because that's just the epistemic condition of humanity. We've got to get used to that. Richard Dawkins has a very different view, a very modern view, I have to say. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we'd expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind goodness and difference. And that's quite a well-known quote. It's from the book River Out of Eden. And what I want to make to you is that is an observation. It is in effect Dawkins saying, this is the way I see it. And you might like to notice also that in effect it is, I observe the universe like this, I take this intellectual map, I put it onto nature, the two seem to map up quite well. In effect it's saying, in his view, there is a resonance between a meaningless ideology and what I see in the universe. But it needs to be said, this is actually a matter of judgment. It's not a scientific judgment. A scientific judgment, I think, would be that the universe does not itself disclose meaning or value or purpose. I think that's something we have to do as human agents. But I think myself this is an overstatement, but it is a very influential overstatement. Now, for those of you who want an even more interesting overstatement, we're going to look at this one, which I think is well worth reading. If you find it rather tedious, you can stop about page 11, which is where I take this is Alex Rosenberg talking about what a scientist would say in response to certain questions. And I'm going to say to you, this illustrates quite well the kind of confidence, in my view, I'm afraid, excessive simplicity of this kind of scientistic. Note the word scientistic, it's an ugly word, but it's a word people tend to use for a way of thinking, which in effect transfers the moral authority of science from its own domain to other domains, and finds that it doesn't actually give you answers that work very well. Is there a God? No, that's not all about. What's the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. Look at this one. What's the meaning of life? What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Now, at this point, I hope everyone in this room will be, the sort of mental alarm bells will be ringing. And I think that, those of you who are scientists would say, well, looking at this one, this isn't right. What you might say is, science arguably does not give us a basis for making this judgment. I would live with that. But saying there is no difference between them, I think, is rather an overstatement. And one of the issues really is as to whether science has an authority beyond its own domain. In other words, are we talking about domain-specific authorities? That is to say, that science, in effect, works in this area, which needs further discussion, but beyond it, actually, it doesn't really have the methodologies necessary to answer the kind of questions we're looking at. Similarly, religion. Again, many of you at this point will say, well, look, there are massive questions we can talk about here. Science designates a range of research methods. Religion designates an even greater range of ways of looking at things. Science and religion is actually a very, very vague, very, very broad category indeed, and we have to agree with that. But the point I'm trying to make is we've got to try and figure out at least how we might get these things to talk to each other and map out possible rules of engagement. Mary Midgley is a philosopher who I suggest you might read on the kind of questions I'm talking about this morning. Mary Midgley at Minutes 95. She was one of a group of young women philosophers at Oxford back in the 1940s, early 1950s, who were like Iris Murdoch, Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, Mary Warnock, and they were exceptionally talented, and she is still going strong, and in her recent writings she's been very critical of what she calls scientism. Again, science is able, in effect, to answer questions beyond its domain, and by doing so, eliminates the plausibility of other answers. Scientism mistakes, she writes, doesn't lie in overpraising one form of knowledge, but in cutting that form off from the rest of thought, in treating it as a victor who's put all the rest out of business. Now, I want to suggest to you that actually there is a cultural debate going on here about science, with in effect this issue as to whether science is able to answer all our questions or merely some. I think that it's important, and Mary Midgley, I think, is mapping out a very important question, which I'm sure we'll be coming back to in the course of this discussion. So how might we frame the relationship between science and religion? Well, it's very difficult. And I think any answer you give is going to be provisional. I would suggest there are perhaps three broad ways of looking at this, but all of you here will say, well, we can nuance this, we can extend this very easily, and you're right. One, a very influential model, which is still prevalent in the media, is to say that science and religion are essentially, and by essentially I mean in terms of their intrinsic identities, are in perennial conflict. And you might think of Richard Dawkins, but I have to say to you, all religious fundamentalists will be in that category as well. That's the media narrative of our culture, I have to say. I mean, the scholarship's moved on by about a generation, but the media lag behind this in a very big way. Then there'd be this kind of isolationist perspective, which you find, for example, Karl Barth, a theologian, Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, is a scientist. In effect, science and religion don't really have anything to say to each other, anything to do with each other. They're best kept apart. Non-overlapping magisteria, if you want to use that kind of vocabulary, but basically, there's nothing to be said here. Don't fight each other, just don't talk to each other. Then there's a rather more indeterminate view, which I represent, and I'm sure quite a few well, Alister would see it as well, which is to say that actually if you get these things right, and that's a very big if, then they can interact and allow us an enriched vision of reality. And that's the line I'll be taking in this talk. Not necessarily to say, look, you've got to go along with this, but rather to say, look, I think there are interesting possibilities here and give you some food for thought. So I would suggest that there are three main approaches that we can use in thinking about how science and religion interact. And these are not kind of models for mapping out science and religion, it's much more ways of understanding reality and seeing how science and religion map onto these. And basically, it's to say, look, we can think about multiple maps of reality, we can think about multiple levels of reality, and we think about multiple narratives that we tell in order to make sense of reality. What I'm going to do, if I may, is just talk you through each of these and see what you think of them, see how you might take these and use these in your own particular areas. I'm going to begin with multiple maps. One of the reasons this is very, very easy to understand. Another is that lets me come back to Mary Midgley, who I think is very, very good. This is the approach I picked up when I was about 23, 24, in conversation with Charles Coulson back at Oxford. Coulson was Oxford's professor of theoretical chemistry, and he had figured out ways of relating science and faith. And his basic approach is, look, they take different perspectives on the same reality. Coulson enjoyed climbing mountains. And he particularly enjoyed climbing Ben Nevis. And in one of his lectures, which is very, very accessible and worth reading, he says, look, think of Ben Nevis. If you look at it from one angle, it's very, very craggy, very, very rough. If you look at it from a different angle, it's very woody with a slow upland grade. And his point is that you can just give multiple descriptions of Ben Nevis seen from different perspectives. If you didn't know it, you'd think we were talking about a different mountain. But actually it's the same mountain, and the individual descriptions combine to give a total description which transcends the individual descriptions, and each of those individual descriptions is right, but it's only part of the picture. It's a classic perspectivalist approach, and one that I think you can use quite well, but Mary Midgley, I think, does it rather better. She says, think about looking into an aquarium, okay? And she says, look, we can't see it hold above, so we peer in at it through a number of small windows. We can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist that our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shan't get very far. Now again, it's one of those analogies which is simply so good, it doesn't need explanation. Once you get the analogy, you see the point she's making. And what she is saying, it basically is, look, there are many perspectives on a complex reality, and we need them all to give the richest possible picture. And anyone who says my perspective is the only perspective or the right perspective, in effect, needs a serious talking to. It's that sort of thing. And you can see immediately how this gives you one way of thinking about the relationship of science and religion. Maybe part of the answer is to say they offer different perspectives on reality. Now, I think that's good. I'm going to say to you it's not good enough. You know, it actually is very, very helpful. It lets you see immediately this dialectic between the whole, the part. Those of you who want to take a spell will think of the whole idea of a shelf or something like that. But actually, it's quite good, but it doesn't do enough. For that reason, we need to think about different levels of reality. This is about perspectives, points of view. Levels of reality is a different way of approaching things altogether. But look at Mary Midgley's point before I move on. For most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. It's a nice little phrase. I want to say to you, think of science as a toolbox, think of religion as a toolbox, different toolboxes, different perspectives. And she then goes on. She has Richard Dawkins in her gun sights here. If we limit ourselves to the method of science in general, or one science in particular, we needlessly lock ourselves into a bizarrely restricted view of meaning. You don't need to. You shouldn't. That's not the way things are. In effect, expand your vision And so that's a perspectivalism approach. You can see that it's helpful, it's easy to grasp, gives you some useful answers, but not enough in my view. Levels of meaning, levels of reality is different. There's a kind of philosophy you might call critical realism. In fact, what it's saying is, look, what we can do is think not so much of different perspectives, where you're looking at a building from A, B, C, and D, but rather you're thinking of a stratified reality, where there are levels. And you might say that one science investigates at this level, a different science investigates at this level. For example, you might almost create a hierarchy of sciences. You might go physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology. I mean, you can see how there are going to be boundary disputes all over the place, but nevertheless it makes the point that actually you can stratify natural sciences in this way, which help you understand the distinct methodologies they use, but also how, in effect, while something like biology, in effect, will build on chemistry and physics in helping you make sense of things, whereas on the whole, physics doesn't really make much use of biology, because biology kicks in later in life. I mean, think of, for example, the whole question of how you explain the origins of life. Actually, it's very, very hard to do that at a purely biological level. You need something deeper than that to really get that sorted out. But just think of the imagery, different levels, okay? And you may find that one discipline answers a question at one level and another at a different level. Those of you who are scientists, think of the different ways in which a physicist, a chemist, and a biologist would think about electrons. They are very, very differently conceived of each of those disciplines. It's the same basic electron, all the same. Frank Rhodes, president of Cornell University in the 1990s, thought long and hard about these issues and came up with an analogy which is endlessly repeated and is going to be repeated even more this morning, I'm afraid. This analogy goes back to the 1960s, and Frank Rhodes asks us to imagine somebody putting a kettle on a gas ring. Okay, 1960s, on a gas ring, and the kettle starts to boil. And Frank Rhodes' question says, why is the kettle boiling? One answer, of course, would be, well, this gas coming out of the gas ring, the gas catches fire. And in burning, it sort of liberates energy. Energy transfers to the kettle, the water reaches boiling point and it boils. And you have to say that's right. But Frank Rhodes said, well, of course, there's another answer, which is I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. Now, just think about this, okay? Answer one, gas burns. Answer two, wanted to make a cup of tea. I'm going to say to you, they're both right. They're both right. The fact that question one, answer one is right, does not mean answer two is wrong. It means that answer one and two are part of a bigger picture. And once you get at that point, then you can see immediately how this sets you up for a very good discussion. But Frank Rhodes hasn't spoken properly, here he is. These are different answers, i.e. tea and gas. But both are true, both are complementary and not competitive. One answer is appropriate to a particular frame of reference, other than another frame of reference, a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. Now, if I had more time, I do not, I would talk in more detail about critical realism because it is actually extremely helpful in dealing with complex realities. For example, the idea of illness. You can stratify in terms of pathology, in terms of impairment, in terms of social engagement and so on. It's a very, very interesting approach. But just for my purposes this morning, this is a way of thinking about the relationship of science and religion. Needs a lot of nuancing. At a very, very simple level, and you need to put in brackets immediately afterwards, and this needs further discussion. Science is quite good at answering how questions, not so good at answering why questions. And indeed, very often a scientific answer to a why question is an elaborated how answer. You think about that. So the point I'm making is this is actually quite a helpful way of moving ahead to this discussion. Now, that comes to narratives. Now, narratives are basically coming in quite a big way. If you're an anthropologist, or if you're into literary theory, then you will know how important these are. This is from a a sort of fairly standard article on anthropology, in effect just saying, look, there is something about us as human beings, we don't know why, but it's obvious that in effect we are animals who must fundamentally understand what reality is, who we are, how we ought to live, by locating ourselves within the larger narratives or meta-narratives that we hear and tell, that constitute what is for us real and significant. I want to say to you that that's not telling us why we do this. It's just saying that we do this. And actually it is quite important. We tell stories. And that is true of us as individuals. It's also true of us as cultures. This is about the individual and the corporate level. And if we look at a good sociologist into this, and my favourite would be Christian Smith in his book Moral Believing Animals, but again there are lots of others you could look at. Christian Smith again says, look, as a matter of observation, and this is not saying this is right, it's just saying, look, we do this, whether it's right or wrong, we use multiple narratives. He says that no single narrative is adequate to organise and correlate on its own the complexities of human existing experience. He gives lots of examples, he gives 10. And I've generously limited them slightly in this slide. But some of them would be a Christian narrative, a capitalist prosperity narrative, a scientific enlightenment narrative, a chance and purposeless narrative. And here's the really interesting point. Again, empirically, what Christian Smith is saying is people, A, use multiple narratives, and B, they tend to use them in a non-integrated way. In other words, when you're talking about, why is the world, why do awful things happen in the world, you might actually pick up on the Christian narrative. When you're trying to vote an election, you might actually pick up on a rather different narrative and so on. And what he's trying to make is actually, it's almost as if narratives are limited. That, they have a sort of little domain, which is very, very good, and then kind of we need others to fill in other bits. If you like, a meta-narrative is a bundle of narratives. Not a single narrative, really, really big, but lots of them. And the point he's making is this. If this is the way things are, then might science and religion fit into this way of thinking? Now, I think further work needs to be done, but I think you can see how this might move us in a good direction. In my view, this works best in thinking about cultural understandings of science and religion, where very often you'll find that a narrative like the progressive socialism narrative, the scientific enlightenment narrative, in effect say this is the way it is or ought to be, and then kind of constrain the evidence to fit that. But actually, you can see how the use of narratives in this way might give you perspectives on that. So let me just leave that with you. Just say I've given you 3 toolkits to think about and decide how you might use them. So I want to move on. I want to move on to talk about why science and religion are really important by looking at Einstein. And the reason I'm choosing to do this simply is because we've all heard of Einstein. He's really, really interesting. And actually, his own personal history, I think, brings out quite well the importance of some of the themes we're looking at during this week. I need to say to you that Einstein is complicated in this area, and he says some things that actually seem to contradict each other. So you will find that those who want to say that Einstein is a kind of scientific atheist will pick up on some bits. Those who want to say he's really a kind of very excited theist will pick on different bits. I'm just going to try and tell you the full picture and then focus in on one thing, which I think you'll find to be really interesting. If you want to follow through on this, the best book in my view is Matt Chandler's book, Einstein Religion. It seems to me to get the complicated structure of this absolutely right. But at the same time, gives you lots of good quotes, which you'll find interesting in taking this through. Einstein didn't really believe in personal God, and that I think is quite clear. But if he didn't believe in a personal God, he had this deep sense of something inexplicable, something that lay on the far side of cognition, something that really excited admiration and almost, as you could say, worship. He says, if something is in which can be called religious, it's the unbounded admiration for the structure of the world so far as our science can reveal it. So that's one of his angles on the whole issue of science and faith. Einstein refused to use the word atheist to refer to his position. He just felt that closed down what was actually potentially a very, very interesting discussion. Einstein was saying, in effect, look, I personally don't believe in a personal God, but there is something there which requires explanation, which elicits wonder, if you like. And he does give us some wonderful quotes. This, in my view, is one of the best. The eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that we can represent this, the fact that, why is it that there is some kind of resonance between the way we think and the way the world is? And again, I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, but those of you who've read Eugene Wigner's wonderful essay, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, he gives lots of examples of the way in which mathematics represents things that, frankly, no one had any idea that it represented when they were developed. And then he says, look, the real issue is what is the big picture that makes sense of this remarkable effectiveness of mathematics? It's a mystery in the good sense of the word, and it's something that elicits further reflection and discussion. And you can see Einstein there making what I think is a very similar point. Why is it that we, as very finite creatures, can make so much sense of stuff? And that remains on the table as being a very important point for discussion. In 1949, he wrote this book, The World as I See It, and again, he's really talking about this sense of standing on the brink of something enormous and significant. I mean, I might use the word liminality, I suppose, and knowledge of the existence of something we cannot penetrate, or the manifestations of the profoundest reason and the most radiant beauty, which are only accessible to our reason in their most elementary forms. In other words, we get something of this, but we get a bit of it. It's this knowledge, this emotion that constitutes a truly religious attitude. In this sense alone, I'm a deeply religious man. Or think of this well-known letter, that we catch hold of the tail of the lion. And it's only the tail we've got, but we know there's a lot more, as it were, waiting to be explored. Einstein, again, just talking about his own wrestling with this deep issue of science and faith, and not really having crystallized his answers, but being pretty sure about some things he knew weren't right. And one of them was, look, you can't rubbish a transcendental attitude because there's something there that points in this direction. Although he didn't believe in the personal God, Einstein held that, I quote, such a belief seems to be preferable to the lack of any transcendental outlook. So what I'm trying to say to you is that Einstein's complex. Just get that idea, and then we're going to move on and look at something really interesting about all of that with this wonderful quote. Fanatical atheist. I have no idea who he is talking about, or indeed who he prophetically might be referring to. Well, I say, yes, who are still feeling the weight of their chains which they've thrown off after hard stubble. They are creatures who, in their grudge against traditional and open people, cannot bear the music of the spheres. I think it is better. I didn't check it, I thought I could hear, but it's better. They don't want to hear it. And what he's saying there is, look, these guys have got a controlling worldview which limits what they see. And Einstein was saying, I'm not like that, I'm open, and I know there's something there, and I can't actually put my finger on it, but there's something that needs more explanation. So what I'm saying to you is there's lots of food for reflection there, what Einstein is saying. The ambiguity of nature, the limitations on human language. Bearing in mind, Einstein is simply saying, here am I reflecting. There's no attempt to bring in a kind of way, what if there were a God who self-disclosed? That's sort of way not his thing. But nevertheless, he's interesting, I think, in many, many ways. In 1930, he said, look, I'm going to three basic impulses and motivations for religious belief: fear, social morality, and a feeling of cosmic awe or religiosity. And his argument is that science challenges fear and social morality, but affirms three. This is very good, I think. This is Einstein reflecting on the relationship between science and morality. Science can only ascertain what is, not what should be. And outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. You can put that side by side with Peter Medawur's reflections on ultimate questions. There are these big questions we need to answer. Some of them are existential, some of them are moral. And again, you see Einstein being very, very clear, looking, when it comes to moral judgment, science doesn't actually help us all that much. Those of you who've read Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, will actually appreciate the wisdom of Einstein's judgment there. Harris's argument, in my view, is very, very weak. So, now we come to the bit which I really want to talk about. And this is Einstein's letter of condolence, written to the family of Michel Bess, a lifelong friend who died in March 1955. You need to know one piece of information to make sense of what follows. Bessel, like Einstein, was a physicist. So anyway, he's writing to the family of this guy who's just died, and this is a letter of condolence. I've extracted 3 sentences, and they are representative of letters of whole. Now, he's departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing for believing physicists like us. To know that the distinction between past, present, and future has only the meaning of a persistent illusion. Now, as you read that, I think several thoughts will go through your mind. The one that might stand out is this: what on earth would the family have made of this? It's kind of a strange letter of condolence. But secondly, if you just take Einstein's theory of relativity and apply it to that, you can see exactly what he means. Look. There's a world line, and there's x, y, z, t1, and there's x1, y1, z1, t2, and they're different. That's the past, that's the future, and so you just move from there to there. So that happens all the time. Except, as human beings, as you and I look at this, we say, well, actually, this just isn't good enough. I mean, there's a lot more to life than just moving from that point to that point through death. Sure, there's more that needs to be said. And interestingly, we know Einstein had really serious misgivings about this. If I put it very, very crudely, most of the subjective things between past, present, future are real and match profoundly. Physics says one thing, psychology something very, very different. And okay, human life is incredibly brief when seen against the backdrop of cosmic time, but it's the only life we've got. And so for us, this is significant. Now, do you remember right at the beginning I talked about that point that Ortega was making, scientists are human beings. They've got emotions, they've got feelings, they're looking for meaning. And what, in effect, seems to emerge from this is that Einstein basically wasn't delivering at a certain level. Now, the key point I'm going to make is this. Einstein talked a lot about these things to Lord Carnot, a well-known Austrian philosopher, and they discussed what Carnot calls the now. What he means by that is that the enormous significant fact that you and I are alive right now and think about the past and reflect about an unknown future. That's what Carnot says. The problem of now worried Einstein seriously. He explained that the experience of the now meant something special for men, something different from the past and the future. Now look at this. But that this important difference doesn't and cannot occur within physics. That's the point he's making. Einstein thought that these scientific descriptions cannot possibly satisfy our human needs. That there is something essential about the now which is just outside of the realm of science. Now you can see that actually fits in very well with a lot of stuff that Einstein quoted from earlier. In effect, this idea of liminality, this idea of a sense of transcendence, but I'm not quite sure where it's taking you, but there's something there that in effect is forcing you to think and reflect and anticipate. And Carnot's point really was that Einstein had no doubts about relativity, but there is a question about whether this is cognitively satisfactory and existentially efficient. Maybe one way of thinking about science and religion is in effect to draw that graph, where in effect you have cognitive satisfaction, existential satisfaction, and begin to see religion as something to do with that existential domain. Now, some people say immediately, well, that's interesting, but it's not right, because surely there are other areas of science which are more instant existential questions, e.g. psychology, and B, most religions actually do have cognitive dimensions, trying to make sense of things. I would say that's important. What I'm saying, though, is this framework might be helpful in trying to understand their relationship. And I think this is a really important point. Why, on its own, science may not deliver the goods. Why we may need something much deeper and richer if you're going to move ahead. So if I could use a simple analogy, which I think it might be helpful, think about a big picture. The question is, does science give you the full picture? Does it give you part of it and require you, in effect, to find another source or sources to fill in the other parts of the picture? And one way of thinking about this is to say that religion, faith, is a way of filling in bits of the picture that science doesn't give. Some of you will want to stand up to me and say, you talked about Charles Coulson earlier, and he was the biggest opponent there ever was of the idea of the God of the gaps. And you're right. But what he was saying was, in effect, look, he objected to the idea of kind of way inventing God to fill explanatory gaps in science, almost a matter of principle. For Coulson, religion gave you a big picture. It's not that God was to be found in these minuscule gaps. It was that God was to be found in the capacity of the human mind to make sense of things at all. Very similar to Einstein's point about the eternal mystery of the world is its explicability. Or indeed someone like C.S. Lewis, who makes a very similar point when he talks about believing in Christianity as he believes the sun has risen, not simply because he sees it, but because by it he sees everything else. So this might be a helpful way of looking at it. And this is the view that you find in William Ralph Inman. Most people say, who? And I know, but I'm going to two reasons. A, because I think it's very, very good. And B, because it's quoted in one of Charles Coulson's book as a very helpful way of thinking about things. And so this is from a book called Faith and Its Psychology, published in 1910. The psychology is a bit passé, but this is not. He's talking about the idea of God. He says, look, rationalism tries to find the place of God in its picture of the world. In other words, there's this inventory of the world, and the theist adds one more item called God. If you're into Occam's principle of parsimony, then that's just pointless. But Inge's point is that's what rationalism thinks. It's not the way things are. Because, of course, if you believe in God in the rich sense of the word, it has explanatory fecundity. God, he writes, cannot be fitted into a diagram. And he gives us this sentence, I think is brilliant. I'll leave this on the screen in case anyone wants to write it down. He is rather the canvas on which the picture is painted, or the frame in which it's set. And what Inge is really getting at there is the idea that God is not simply one extra item we propose, but rather something absolutely fundamental, which, if it is there, supports everything else that is placed upon it or projected on, how you want to think about it. And I think that's very interesting. It gives you two themes immediately. One of them is the theme of intelligibility. We can begin to think of God as a lens which brings things into focus, which in effect, if seen rightly, it's not fuzzy, it's that you're right at focus. You've got to see things in a new way. So the idea of intelligibility is unquestionably there, but alongside it, there's another idea, which is coherence. That is to say, things hang together. That in effect, you're looking at a picture, and it's held together by the canvas, which holds its various elements together. I haven't done any history. Let's just give you one tiny little example, and that is John Donne's very famous comment of 1611. He was reflecting on recent skeptical philosophies and also his perception that the shifting scientific culture of his day, back in the 17th century, was kind of eroding the medieval sense of a sort of an integrated whole, a sort of cosmic harmony. And he wrote these lines, "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone." You can see how this actually is very, very interesting. If you read Nancy Cartwright, particularly her Dappled Universe, this idea that the laws of nature are really local rather than universal. They give you insight into that bit of the universe, but not the universe as a whole. But maybe what Ian's just saying is that religion gives you this ability to talk about a coherent reality. In other words, not just A, B, C, D, E, but rather these snapshots which turn out to be part of a greater picture, which the greater picture itself allows you to position. If you want an analogy, think you're climbing a mountain, you're looking down, and you see woods and streams and villages and trees and all sorts of things. You take pictures of each of these, but someone's got a better camera than you. Take a panoramic shot, and you realize each of your snapshots can be pasted on to that bigger picture, which accommodates them, but also shows you each of them has a rightful position, which allows you to see how it relates to other things. And that's actually quite a helpful way of looking at things. Now, I'm running out of time, and so what I'm going to do is end with a quote from William James, who I always enjoy reading. William James suggests that religious faith is basically, I quote, a faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found and explained. And James here is actually being quite restrained, but nevertheless he's saying something really interesting. What he's saying is, look, science has a very important place in all of these things. Maybe one of the things that religion does is to give you a still bigger picture, which helps you to make sense of science, but also compensates for its limits. Now, those limits are not something which require criticism in any way. I mean, science is science. You've just got to get used to that. That's great. But because it is science and not something else, you've got to respect its limits. If I were to critique Richard Dawkins in one sentence, I think it would be that he treats science as if it's a kind of religion or universal worldview, whereas it's not really. But the paradox is that because we're human beings, we do need something more than that. That's why, for me, the dialogue in science and religion is so interesting, because actually it gives you this possibility of a big picture, which maybe on their own neither can give you, and also allows you to begin to say, look, maybe science isn't very good at establishing meaning or determining what is right, but there are ways of doing that from another place. And therefore, in my own personal world and in culture as a whole, bringing these things together can lead to an enrichment of our vision. And it seems to me that's the kind of thing that Faraday Institute is trying to encourage. And certainly I'd say it's something I want to encourage as well. There's a lot more that needs to be said, but I think the best thing to do is simply draw stumps here and hand over things to you. And I'm very happy to be led by you in whatever directions you want to go for the next half hour. Half an hour. So, over to you.
Let me start by saying that I think this was the most brilliant lecture on this subject that I have ever heard. And I've heard many lectures on the subject which range from bad to terrible. But basically, there's one thing that bothers me. We understand that science isn't everything, meaning and so on go beyond science. You've called this faith, but I don't understand where God fits in. That is, the idea that this implies God doesn't follow from what you said. And in fact, what Richard Dawkins says, and I think correctly, says many things incorrectly, that why should I believe in something for which there's no empirical evidence whatsoever? To take the example of, I forget what, his name is, why should I believe? I certainly don't believe that a teapot goes around Jupiter, even though I've never examined it and can prove it. How does all this relate to, and God, different Christians have a different God, the Buddhists have a different God, the Jews have a different God. In fact, they're killing each other every day from the newspapers because my belief in God isn't exactly your belief in God, so I kill you. How does all this fit to religion in the sense of God?
Well, it's great to have a very big question like that to begin with. Let me try and answer it. I think that, I mean, the reason I talk about that question very much simply was that there's so much to try and pack into 45 minutes. But I think one of the questions Dawkins asks, which you picked up on in a very big way, is why should I believe something for which there is no evidence? And when you kind of get past that and just begin to de-simplify it and try and get at the real issues there, I think what he's saying is, why do you make a judgment for which the empirical evidence is at best ambiguous? And it's a perfectly fair question. And I think that one of the points I'll make this afternoon, when I talk more about this, I'm looking at the kind of way the interaction of the new atheism and epistemology. I think one of the dilemmas of being a human being is that actually we very often do believe in things which the evidence is very often ambiguous, ambivalent, or simply lacking. I mean, for example, I mean, I've had private conversations with Dawkins, in fairness, I don't repeat at all. But one of the things you might imagine, somebody says to me, well, of course, I believe in the goodness of human nature. That's something that I really feel passionately about. And I'd really like to believe in that. Actually, I couldn't, because I look at history and I see a mess. And I look at the present and I see an even bigger mess. And, I just think, that's an aspiration I'd love to endorse, but the evidence isn't there. But I understand why you're saying that, because it's an important thing to say. But for me, one of the problems is, if you make man the measure of all things, and man's a bit messed up, well, how reliable is the... I mean, if I move in a different direction altogether, I mean, if Richard Dawkins' restrictions are right, and religion is something of man's inventing, then what on earth does that tell us about human nature? It's a very interesting question about that. I think that the best answer I can give at this stage, because I think I'm probably going to touch on many of the questions you've raised this afternoon, is to say that it seems reluctantly that we have to draw the conclusion that while there are some things we can be absolutely sure of, I don't mean Benjamin Franklin's death and taxes, I mean some things like, 2 and 2 make 4, which of course is right, but doesn't give you a reason to get up in the morning. It's when you start looking at anything that is existential, like, freedom is better than oppression, democracy is better than fascism, there is a God, all these things which actually really matter to people profoundly. And yet when you challenge them and say, can you prove that is true, is a real issue. Or indeed, when I say to my more rationalist friends, usually after a long evening, I'll say to them, look, you're saying reason is omnipotent. Can you just prove that without actually using reason? Because all you're doing is kind of indulging in the kind of epistemological fideism. And they get very angry about this, I have to say, because for them it's just self-evident true reason is omnipotent. When you actually challenge them on the basis of argumentation to show that's the case, it is really quite difficult. The final point you're making is very important, because if we cannot prove things to be true, we need to be generous to those who disagree with us. And that's one of the points Hilary was making at the beginning. We do have to be aware that very often we've come to various conclusions of our own for reasons we entirely understand. But nevertheless, we have to realize that maybe somebody else is seeing it from a different perspective. And actually, when rightly understood, that might help us think these things through for ourselves, which is why I like this conference very much. Thank you.
Another question in the same row.
Could we be in danger of denigrating science? You say religion has the big question. Maybe science has some big questions as well. You say religion is deep and rich. Maybe science is deep and rich. You say science has its limits. Does religion have its limits?
Well, yes to all those. I think what I'm not doing is, in effect, making a pejorative value judgment, saying, science, religion's great, science is bad. Science is great, religion's bad. I'm saying, as a matter of fact, we have science, we have religion. We've got to try and figure out where they are on maps. I have the pleasure of having been a scientist and also being a theologian, and therefore for me, I'm looking at two things I personally think are potentially very, very good, and both of which can be potentially very, very bad. And we've got to find out how on earth we do these. I mean, it's obvious, I think, from the previous question, that religion can turn out very, very badly. So, unfortunately, can science. I mean, just who makes these atom bombs that, worry us so much? I think the real issue is first of all, how do we understand these to relate to each other? And then, is there any way, if I put it like this, and here I'm making a value judgment, that the good bits of one can help with the weak points of the other? And it seems to me that's a very helpful discussion. I'm not trying to impose my views on what the good bits and bad bits are. I'm just saying in general terms they're there. And the question is there any way we could have a conversation that could enrich them, rather than in effect mean that they both take on the bad points of the other one? Thank you.
Thank you.
me again, sort of listening to some of the quotes of Einstein, that for him, wonder was a key component. And also, like Dawkins quite often talks about wonder. I was just wondering what place you see wonder in the science-faith debate.
I think the answer is that it plays a major role. And if you go back to Aristotle, I mean, for Aristotle, the idea of wonder, he used the Greek word thaumazein, but it means basically sort of being taken aback, being overwhelmed by something. For him, that's a gateway to knowledge. In effect, wonder is in fact an opportunity, an invitation to enrich the mind, to in effect open up to other things. I admit, for some people, wonder is something that simply exists in itself and of itself. I think Dawkins is kind of in that category. But he's in very good company. Someone like Goethe, for example, towards the end of his life, just said, look, you have this sense of das Erstaunen, wonder is a perfectly good translation of that. And he says, and look, you can't go beyond it, you can't go behind it, you just enjoy the experience. For me, wonder is something that A, I enjoy, and then B, I say, no pun intended, I wonder what lies beyond that. What is it that I am so excited by? Is there any way that the deeper investigation of what is so exciting me lead to a still further intellectual sense of wonder and admiration? So I think that's very important. I think one of the things I would say, though, is that the danger is that wonder is something that happens, and very often, once you get used to it, it just ceases to be there. I mean, the professional astronomer does not have the same sense of wonder when looking at the night sky, even though they know an awful lot more about the night sky than I do. Or again, I mean, let me give you a really stupid example. I mean, one of my favourite books is Heidi. You may, if you don't know the story of Heidi, I mean, Heidi is this little girl who changes the lives of everyone who she meets, including her old, grumpy old grandfather. But she makes friends with Peter the goat herd. And they go up into the Alps together. And there's one evening where something called the Alpenglühen, sort of, the Alps light up as if they are on fire. And Heidi is overwhelmed, and this is astonishing. And she turns to Peter and says, it's wonderful. He shrugs his shoulders and says, it's always like that. What's the big deal? And it's that sense, wonder is very, very wonderful and happens, and yet you can't get repeated all the time. And so for me, Einstein is one of those who says, look, this sense of wonder, he used the phrase awed wonder. And he says it's a sort of this sense of being overwhelmed by something so amazing. It makes you want to try and grasp what's behind it, even though you can only grasp it imperfectly and partially. It does seem to me that's a very important part of the scientific enterprise. Also, I think it helps us begin to understand something of the appeal of religion. Think of Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. You can see where that could take you. I'm just saying, look, maybe the experience of wonder could take us in two different directions. Actually, directions which might initially bifurcate, but which could, if seen in certain ways, come back together. Thank you.
Many people of faith are convinced that their chosen religion is the correct one at the expense of others. Could this idea of multiple levels and perspectives of reality be used to support an interfaith dialogue?
Well, the answer is it could be, and I think a lot more work would need to be done. But I think it certainly is helpful in beginning to get across the idea that maybe because of our own angle of approach, we're focusing on one perspective or one level. And the great thing about theory is it heightens your attentiveness towards some things. But the difficulty is a theory also prevents you from seeing other things because you don't expect it to be there. I was reading recently the accounts of the discovery of the planet Uranus by William Herschel. And so the funny thing is that actually, although Herschel discovered Uranus in 1784 or something, and people had seen it long beforehand, just hadn't recognized it for what it really was. And the problem was their theory said there are no planets beyond Saturn, so when they saw something, they just assumed it was a fixed star. And so the theory stopped them from seeing things that were there. And maybe that's a challenge. Maybe that is something that we do need to be aware of, that sometimes our own particular way of looking at things may be enabling in some ways and restricting in others. And that's, although I personally feel very comfortable in my Christianity, I mean, I do enjoy discussions with others because very often it challenges me to think things through further and so on. Whether it means there is something beyond that, which is somehow a shared ultimate view of reality or not, I don't know. I think the jury is very much out on that one. But I think it just must bring home to us the need for caution and respect, which are not inconsistent with commitment. I think I want to emphasize that. You know, you can have a very robust personal commitment, but still be very generous and understanding towards others. But certainly that it's a possibility for further discussion. Thank you.
I think there was a question in the row. Just in front of you.
It was a similar question. If we see something in our imaginations as the creator of the whole universe, he is the original professor of mathematics, astrophysics, genetics, and all the rest of it, then surely we're all worshipping the same God.
Well, again, I personally would be very sympathetic towards that, and your words remind me of something Johannes Kepler said many years ago. He talked about you know, the world being written in the language of mathematics, which I think is very, very interesting and worth further exploration. I think that the difficulty would be that, as I was trying to hint at much earlier in my lecture, the word religion is terribly vague, and it doesn't necessarily entail theism. You know, it could do, but it doesn't necessarily. And therefore, I think I'm just cautious on this because, again, I'm not going to give a historical lecture, but if I were to give a historical lecture, I'd want to look at the changing meaning of that word religion over time, where actually it has acquired developed meanings which I think render it virtually useless as an intellectual category, even though it does help you understand why it's so important culturally. So I'm just nervous about this. I mean, I think I would completely agree with you in what you say. The issue is, how would you translate that into the wider discussion between science and religion, where there are many religions which would, I think, acknowledge many gods in some sense of the word, and some, of course, which acknowledge none at all. And that's why I think one of the reasons why Einstein is, I think, very, very cautious. I mean, he's talking about, he uses the language of transcendence. He'll talk about Spinoza's God, which is a very rationalized version of God, which blends into nature at various points. And so I think all I can say really is that there's a lot of merit in your intuitions. The difficulty is how you map it onto the current realities that we call religion. Thank you.
There was a question right at the back.
Thank you, Professor. In the models for science and religion, you mentioned it can interact and allow us to be enriched when we talk about the third model that you have proposed, that you have set. Now the question is, when we talk about this word religion, it is very broad. You know, so many religions we have in this world. And especially I come from India, where there are so many religions and they don't come together because everyone has their own view and idea. But when we talk about this Einstein, his approach, as you have just mentioned, answered in the last question, my point to you is how you view the relationship of science and religion in such perspective, especially Asian perspective, Asian theology. Because I'm very comfortable in relating science and Christian theology. And your lectures and most of the writing is based on that. But when we talk about this type of relationship in Indian perspective or Asian perspective, then how to move about?
Well, thank you for that question. I think in this lecture I saw myself as, I think I used the phrase a sketch map at the beginning, trying to say, look, I'm trying to give you tools, ways of looking at things, which you can then take and use for yourself. I think every lecturer has to be very honest about the limitations on their own expertise, and I will certainly do that in my case. And I feel very comfortable in talking about, for example, Christianity and sciences, most of the sciences actually, although my anthropology is not as good as it should be. But I would have to say that I don't comment on things that I don't know enough about. And therefore what I have to say to you is that I don't think I can answer your question. Not in the sense of I couldn't say something, I could, but it wouldn't be of any intellectual value to you. And I think that really what I'm saying is, I think that you clearly know much more about this than I do, and I'm just hopeful that the ideas I've been sharing with you may give you some ideas of how you could take them and use that framework for something you clearly know much more about than I do. Because I can't really make that connection. And so, in fact, I'm really just saying I don't think I can give an informed answer, and therefore I shouldn't, because I think A, might mislead you, and B, I probably just show my own ignorance in giving a very bad answer to a very good question.
Can we follow that up with our other Indian delegates at the conference who might have something to add?
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. My question is, should we better frame the relationship as Western science and Western religion? The reason I am saying, following what my friend from India said, in Rig Veda, for example, it says truth is one, and the sages describe it in different ways. Ekamshat vipra bahuda vadanti, which comes very close to your position, third one, that there is no real antagonism between the perspectives. It's just different ways of description. And my question is related, for example, that in some cultures, like Buddhist cultures, Sikh cultures, or maybe some Islamic societies, there is no real difference between what is science and what is religion. Okay. And Dalai Lama, for example, said that for me it's no problem to get rid of some doctrines if it is disproved by science, because your experience will say what is true. So, now question is that should we better define as Western science and Western religion in the way it shaped the world of intellectual development? And second question is, I come from medicine and biology background, and I am a believer of Hindu faith, but I do find that science is more universal than religion, in the sense either it is Cambridge or California or Kolkata, cutting DNA into different pieces by restriction enzymes is much more, straightforward thing. But when you explore and in the quest of God in your own life, you are bound by the cultures and the developments, history, etc. And in a way, it's very personal, but very limiting too.
Thank you. Yes, I think. Those of your scientists in this room will find this a very interesting question. I would resist the phrase Western science, but I know what you mean. Let me see if I can tease this out. For me, science ought to be universal. In other words, it does not matter whether the person doing this experiment is male or female, or Indian or British, or whatever. In effect, the scientific methodology is not culturally contingent. And that for me is one of its enormous strengths. However, we then have to recognize that it's not quite that simple. That actually there are cultural readings of science. And you could quite happily use the phrase Western science to mean a Western cultural reading of science. And there's no doubt that for a variety of historical reasons, science has kind of, at least until fairly recently, been seen in certain very specific ways in the Western media and Western culture in general, although I think that is changing. But I think nevertheless the thing about science is that if it is done properly, then there ought not to be any issue of gender or religion or anything. For example, it makes no sense for me to talk about Christian mathematics. It's either mathematics or it's not mathematics. I think that's something very interesting. But then there are other areas where it's not that simple. There'll be some in this room who will say, actually, we could talk about Christian psychology. And actually, I know what they mean. I know what they mean, because in effect, it's very hard to do psychology without some kind of deeper informing theory about what we are, what it means to be human. So there's very interesting things there. I think the best answer I can give to your question is that I think there are lots of local dialogues going on. And very often these reflect local local situations, local belief systems and so on. But I think that the reason we talk about science and religion in a sort of generalized sense, and I've been doing actually in this lecture, is saying, look, there does seem to be something here which may have different implementations and articulations in different cultural locations, but there seems something similar going on all over the place. And that's why I think it's very helpful to have a conference like this, because it kind of gives you an idea of the kind of conversations that are going on, which may help you have your conversation in your own place. So I think it's a very important thing to do. Thank you.
I would like to come back to your answer to the first question, because it appeared to me that you used almost interchangeably the notion of proof and of evidence, but I'm sure that you don't think the two things are equivalent. So could you comment on the difference between proof and evidence, between scientific evidence and other types of evidence? And do you think that science gives proofs? And do you think there is no evidence for God?
Right, well, this is, how much time do we have left? This is a big question, and I think I do need to try and give a reasonably articulate answer, because it's a good question. I think that it's fundamental that we need to be able to give reasons for things we believe. In other words, we say, look, I don't just accept this. I think the following reasons may be given. Immediately, that brings in the full meaning of words like proof and evidence. And the real difficulty, I think, for me, is that in the natural sciences, you have the interconnectedness of theory and evidence. In other words, that in popular thinking, evidence is just something you observe. But to a scientist, you all know that an observation is only evidence within a theoretical context that gives it that significance. And that entanglement of theory and observation in science is one of its greatest strengths, but it's also one of its greatest weaknesses. If you think of the Richardson Morley experiment of 1882, whatever it was, I mean, where in effect they said, look, there's no evidence for the ether drift, the classic experiment. It wasn't until the 1920s that people actually said, actually, they're probably right. Because, do you remember the thing, the Lorentz contraction, which was proposed as a counter to this? In effect, look, this is the observation, but we propose a counter theory which says, look, under these circumstances, you would not expect to see this because of this. I think that's one of the problems, that in effect, evidence is so intertangled with theoretical pre-commitments. Actually, it's very, very often difficult to disentangle them. So you have this absolute paradox that something which might be proof of one thing could also be proof of something else as well, because in effect they both fit into the same kind of theory. And that's one of the reasons why I think sometimes scientific progress is so difficult, because of the ambiguity of observational evidence. In terms of the word proof, I mean, the word proof, in my meaning of the word, is really limited to logic and mathematics, where I think you can give an absolutely clear proof, which would leave me satisfied that there is no other intellectual option available. In science, it's not really that straightforward. I mean, you could give me very good reasons for going away and thinking, that's right, but there will be a subtext, that's right for the moment. And in due course, it may be shown to be wrong, but that doesn't mean we're foolish for saying that's right at the moment. It means that on the basis of the best evidence we now have available and the best modes of interpretation of evidence, we think that's right. But in 20 years' time, who knows? Universe? Multiverse? Jury's out. But the discussions are ongoing. So I think, for me, one of the major issues here is not so much the debate within science, which I think is conducted by people who know what they're talking about. It's much more cultural perceptions of that, whereby very often people have this idea, science shows that, whereas what actually means is scientists have suggested this tentatively, and it needs further work, but the newspaper headline doesn't actually say that. And so I think really that what I'm saying is that we do need to show that there are good reasons for thinking that things are right. In other words, we might be talking about justification rather than proof. But in many ways, if you take a critical realist perspective, what you have to realize is that different methodologies have different criteria by which you can adjudicate their outcomes. And that may mean that you are much more tentative in some areas than you are in others. So I'm afraid that's a rather unsatisfactory answer. But I think the reason it's unsatisfactory is actually that we have a slightly lesser hold on reality than we would like. And it is rather more provisional. And one of the things Richard Dawkins and I do agree on, and there are relatively few of these matters, I have to say, is that, in 100 years' time we may give up on a theory we presently believe to be absolutely secure simply because of theoretical advances and additional observational evidence. So that's one of the reasons why I actually think that Michael Polanyi is always worth reading, especially his book Personal Knowledge, where he simply reflects on, I suppose, the epistemic dilemma of a scientist who says, look, I believe that certain things are right, and I think I have very good reason for doing so. The difficulty is I know that in a generation's time, some of these will be shown to be wrong, and I don't know which ones they are, but at the moment, I'm justified in holding on to these things. I think that is the paradox of science. It's on a journey. And we know that at some point in that journey in the future, it will negate some of the things it currently believes to be right. But that's not a criticism of science. It's actually an affirmation of its core strength, which is its self-correcting. The difficulty is it's very hard for us to anticipate what those future self-corrections might be. Thank you.
I think on that note, because that's such a big question and such an important question, asked by one of our other speakers who's a physicist, and no doubt we'll perhaps unpack that a little bit more later in the week. I think we should thank Alister for getting us off to such a good start.